This is a complex question that we tried to address today. Thank you so much, all of you, all of the panelists. We're going to put all of the presentations on our website, and plus a few more articles as people have been going to session and sharing information in the audience. They've mentioned a few articles, a few pieces of research, some of which our panelists have put out there that we'll post on the website as well, so you can go to that. So I'm sure you have questions, a lot of thoughts in your head, and we want to hear what you have to say. Millie is in the back. She has a microphone, and if you'll just raise your hand, she'll come to you so that you can use the microphone. We can all hear you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. This was extremely informative and I really appreciate it. A lot of the programs that you covered today are dealing with more urban areas in Michigan. I was wondering if you could speak to what's been happening in some of the more rural parts of Michigan. We know that poverty is a tremendous issue north of the bridge, as well as northern lower peninsula of Michigan as well. What's being done in our rural communities to help provide them with this education and outreach as well?
Excellent. Bill, you travel the state.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
And
Trust me, someone.
The programs that we offer, both in financial money management and in homeownership, are offered in the rural areas the same as in the urban areas. The challenges sometimes are different. In a rural setting where someone lives out in the country 15, 20 miles from a job that doesn't pay more than minimum wage, they spend most of the paycheck that they earn just on the gas to get to and from the job. Then you introduce that to the fact that there's not public transportation, and I may have dwelled on this fact already a little bit, but the vehicles that they have are not always in the best shape. Or if they buy a decent vehicle, they go way in over their head in debt to get the decent vehicle. So transportation struggles are very much an issue in rural areas where folks, if they're not involved in agriculture. So that's a difficult issue in having those higher paying jobs in cities that are close enough to justify it.
So would you say financial literacy is still a point of concern, Erica?
Yeah, I think financial literacy is definitely a point of concern, but I think what Bill's talking about, I think a lot of times it's just some of the issues that may not come up quite as much, but I will say transportation is still a large issue in our urban communities too. So, I think that could go either way. Sometimes though, some of the other things that I've seen, and I've done some work around rural families and loss of employment, and so access to additional jobs. Sometimes, especially how far they are from a larger community when there's a downsizing in that particular economy, it's more difficult a lot of times to find access to work and good quality work. Sometimes the amount of services that are available can be difficult, so I think sometimes it's the lack of resources that may be available to participants. They just may be a little bit more sparse in rural communities, and that's some of the things that we see as well. But I would second Bill, a huge barrier to transportation, in a lot of communities.
Sounds like you do as well, Steve.
It's a huge problem for us, absolutely. And not just the lack of transportation, but also issues like the driver responsibility fee. I mean, here's the irony. The state charges a driver responsibility fee, and we actually have some programs from the state that allow us to pay the driver responsibility fee so someone can get to a workforce training program.
Some of those issues are the same in urban areas, correct? Transportation, financial literacy, services, the kinds of services. Some of these situations are rather unique. Yeah. Millie, it's all up here, all the first row.
Who's next? What about the digital divide? How would you say that plays a role into?
So I haven't done any particular research, but in talking with some of our extension staff that work up in the Upper Peninsula and in the northern region, definitely I think that that's an issue. And thinking about that, I know that there's been some work that has been done to try to rectify that in particular situations, but there's still a huge issue as far as access to those opportunities for Wi-Fi and things like that. I'm also thinking about education related to that, and I think that can also be an issue as well.
Computer literacy and internet access.
If I could just add to that, because I've got one story, and it's not, there's computer literacy, there's access to internet many times, but something like high-speed internet. In one particular instance, a person interested in doing some work online and actually teaching English as a second language, not able to access it from where they live because there's not a high enough upload speed. So that is a critical issue, especially in rural areas.
I will say though, some of our education for MSU Extension, we actually have started doing more webinars and online education to help people that do live in remote areas and can't access the education that we're doing. So although sometimes it's difficult working with libraries and things like that to try to help kind of overcome some of those issues.
I actually have a couple of questions, but I'll start with the one. Several of you mentioned the just-in-time model of addressing the needs of consumers that you service. And it seems to me, instinctually at least, that using a just-in-time model, by time you are ready to implement the just-in-time, the time is really already passed because the client is so far beyond where they can easily be helped that I guess I'm trying to understand how that model is useful in benefiting the client.
And I'll say exactly what you just said is what I was trying to convey, and I apologize if I didn't convey that appropriately, but the just-in-time model really doesn't take into account goal setting. It doesn't take into account that planning piece. And so you're right, as soon as that education happened, yeah, it makes sense for that particular person at that time, but they haven't had all that opportunity to plan and think about what they're going to actually do, and a lot of times they're behind the 8 ball in that particular respect. So there's been a lot of literature to kind of look at the just-in-time as kind of the approach that should be happening, but there's been a lot of financial education experts that have said that's not going to meet the mark. We really need to kind of think about it differently, and really that financial capability model of providing the education with that applied piece is really the piece that seems to stick the most, I would say, with families.
Which makes a lot more sense for long term, because again, there's always the issue of sustainability. Whether or not, if you help a client to get from behind the 8 ball, the goal is to help them long term to be able to sustain that. And again, if you're always helping them just in time to keep them from going over the cliff, that's not really solving the problem. It's only putting the Band-Aid.
I think the catch then is how do we get those people in the door so that they see that there is a need, that the planning does need to occur, and it's not just a reactionary. With the foreclosure crisis, a lot of the research I saw, it was reactionary, right? They got the letter, they needed the help, they came in the door, and they wanted to be served at that particular point, and they didn't realize until after it had happened everything that they had gone through, and all the education that really could have helped them think about it differently. So I think that's kind of the other side of things, is how do you do that? I don't know if you want to add anything with your income tax credit, but that's another piece. They're getting that windfall of money, and what are they going to do with that? And sometimes it's meeting that immediate need at that particular point that they think. And we don't even talk about the refund anticipation loan where they're getting that, taking a loan out. That's another issue that has been a concern, where people are taking a chunk out of their money with that, not just waiting to file.
Thank you.
So there was a thing that came out of, it was a while ago, I think out of the Brookings Institute, that was talking about poverty prevention, and it said the best poverty prevention is for people to finish school, make sure they have a job, and make sure they're married before they have children. Do you think that that is still a good formula, or do you think that, and one thing I'm wondering about particularly is that so many jobs seem to be not well paying, that maybe that's not the solid formula that I hear from a lot of conservatives. Thoughts?
Well, I would, the issue about the well-paying jobs, I don't know if you've seen Michigan Futures report, and there's some really good information in there, familiar with the ALICE standard, and you know, I think that's one of the biggest problems that we see outside of unemployment and poverty is working poor, which is here in Michigan. I think that when you look at poverty, the poverty level plus the ALICE standard, it's 45% of Michigan residents are struggling to pay basic bills. So yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, I think that the formula you put out there is great. What all of us are dealing with is the shortcomings of that formula.
So I've got another question. All of this discussion actually just brought something else to mind too, and that is one of the things that I've seen, at least with the populations that I've worked with over the course of my career, is that so many times the systems as they are set up currently are really very punitive in nature because of the fact that an individual who wants to work, who's capable of working, can go out and try to get a job, who gets a job that doesn't pay more than minimum wage or maybe slightly above, is not earning enough to sustain himself or herself or a family. And so therefore, because they're earning, they're no longer eligible for assistance or that helping hand. And so therefore, the person has to weigh whether or not working actually is advantageous or if they just stop working and receive the assistance. And it seems to me that within the larger population that this just continues to be a cyclical kind of thing. And you have people on assistance, off assistance, on assistance, off assistance, and it becomes a way of life because you can never get in front of the 8 ball, like we mentioned before. And is there any research that you know of that really supports that? Because again, intuitively, it seems like that's something that ought to be just bright line clear. But it seems that no one addresses that cyclical nature of that on again, off again, trying to get ahead of the 8 ball.
I came across a great line the other day that our safety net's become a snare. And I think that's really, you're right. And the other thing I think we see as a real challenge with a lot of our clients that are really trying to get ahead, they're taking hourly employment and they're working really hard to get ahead. They're even willing to work 2 jobs to try and save, but they find that the hourly work is so irregular that it's become an unsustainable. It's not a problem.
This gentleman, okay, go ahead. This whole table.
I have a question for Dr. Sykes, but of course anyone else that has insight, welcome. I know you talked mostly about the earned income tax credit, and it was actually kind of a realization to me that as big as it is compared to TANF. I want to ask a question about TANF. I've been a skeptic of the TANF employment and training area, and I know like the Center for Law and Social Policy and National Skills Coalition and other groups have put out these reports that say even in the best circumstances, the best outcomes for that, somebody still comes out with a job, minimum wage, and still dependent on public benefits. I'm just curious, in your research or your work, you've had any thoughts on that part of TANF, the non-cash assistance part of it?
Sorry, just to clarify your question, you're asking about my understanding of whether or not, sorry, could you clarify that?
The employment and training aspects of TANF, the part that's not the cash assistance, it's been shown to be very ineffective. I just wonder if in your research with people that were on TANF, if that was a factor in their becoming more self-sufficient.
Yeah, so mine was not a comparative study really like focusing in on TANF. In part, the reason that my research has been well received, we wrote a book, we testified before Congress with some of the findings that I presented here today, along with other findings that that we found, is that TANF is an old dinosaur that is not responsive to downturns in our economy. And so the result is that even in the face of the Great Recession, people don't turn towards it. So my research has been oriented towards the promising and responsive kind of social policies that we do have, SNAP or food stamps being one, and the earned income tax credit being another. I will say this, I didn't emphasize in my talk probably strongly enough that post-welfare reform, we have a new welfare state. It's completely different than what we had in the late 90s. And it has transformed to a system of winners and losers. If you are able to find employment, even scrappy, low-wage employment in Michigan or throughout the country, you are better off than you were under the old TANF system. Why? Because of the earned income tax credit. It raises the amount that you receive. It essentially, in terms of numbers, and I didn't present them today, but you can look them up, it essentially gives you everything that you would have received in TANF, which was never generous. And in addition, it allows you to keep your wages without hiding it. Right? So my research focuses on the winners in the system. For those of you who are able to find employment, how are we giving you a hand up? But I can't really concretely answer your question because I don't study the employment aspects of TANF. I will say just by sheer numbers that we know that people are largely not effectively using this system. And in some respects, from a social scientist perspective, it's a real wonder why are even people who could qualify for TANF on paper, and we know what their tax returns are and so forth, why aren't they turning towards TANF? So there's also maybe some stigma attached to that social program that prevents them from accessing it, or there's a reputation that now precedes it saying this is a hand up, but it comes with all kinds of problems, and I don't want to deal with it. I would also emphasize one other thing in response to your question earlier. I would simply say that there was, under the old system, this sensibility of people cycling off and on and off and on over a lifetime. And of course, under the new system, that's not a reality. It's still the perception that we have these long-term welfare recipients, but it's not the lived reality because of time limits under our cash assistance. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about my own financial education, and of course it started with my parents. And do chores, get a little allowance, and save, and then you can buy a candy or a toy. And then my mother, a stay-at-home mom in the 30s and 40s and 50s, telling me never be financially dependent on a man. And then get your education, be the smartest, not girl, be the smartest in the class, do your homework, you know. So now I'm wondering, all these programs that you talk about, if you're offering childcare while you present the program to the adults, are you teaching financial education to the children to break the cycle so that they learn financial education when they're 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, you know, while they're in school? If they're not teaching it in elementary school. We had a little grocery store in 2nd grade where we had to learn money, you remember that? And so if it's not happening in school, are you helping to teach this next generation of your clients?
Well, I can talk a little bit from the MSU Extension standpoint. We do have some staff that are, so the team that Bill and I really represent is our financial and homeownership adult education. But we have comparable staff in our Children and Youth Institute that do work. Some of you may be familiar with 4-H, and so that is, there's some programs that are happening through 4-H as well that are doing education with young people. So you're right, you know, it's not happening as much in schools as it used to be. And so trying to figure out how we can get some education. Some of it is happening through out of school time, some of it is happening still in schools as kind of guest presentations. We work a lot with the credit unions. I know credit unions do a lot of work, so it's just doing it a little bit different ways, I think, as far as trying to get the education out there, because it's an issue. And I teach a personal finance class at Michigan State. I've got 350 students. I actually have somebody guest teaching for me right now as a part of that. And I'm always surprised at the lack of knowledge that my students are coming in. I have freshmen, I have seniors that are going to be leaving and graduating. And some of the questions that they ask really frankly scare me sometimes as far as the lack of knowledge in the education, and they're going to be leaving with a degree. So it's an opportunity. I think there's education in a lot of levels that are really needed.
Okay. Is there an online class for that?
We actually offer it. Well, we have an online education as well, but we have it fall, spring, and summer, 2 sessions in the summer. It's a full class, it fills up. That's a good thing.
Can I say something on that?
Yes,
So
please.
this isn't my, the heart of my expertise, but I do want to say something. Financial literacy in this country is meager. And you know this to be true because some of you who have grand financial knowledge did so on your own. And it is the case that institutionally it's not prioritized. So you can make it all the way through high school, all the way through college, and still disappoint Dr. Toby because you haven't picked up enough knowledge. And I think it's really, first, before I say this, I want to acknowledge that I think the work that my panelists are doing is so worthwhile and impressive. And at the same time, I want to say this, that there has been this mantra and this narrative about if only our vulnerable families would know more and do better and pinch those pennies and know where to invest the rest of the pennies. And okay, I think that there's some value to that, and I can get behind that statement because I think middle class should also learn to pinch their pennies and know where to save their pennies. But I also want to suggest this, that the minimum wage has stagnated to the point where its peak value in terms of real purchasing power, it peaked in 1968. And even as we creep up with our own minimum wage in Michigan, we're not going to achieve that amount. It would take something like $9.70 or something like that to even come close to where we were. So I'm going to provocatively say, yes, learn to pinch your pennies, but give folks a nickel. You know what I'm saying? Like, give them more pennies. And also, always let us be every one of us should be reflective about whether or not we expect more from our most vulnerable families in terms of their ability to budget and strategize and have a strategic plan relative to my own middle class status, where I don't want to share my own budgeting, foibles because they're plentiful. So let's not expect them to know more or do better than we do.
Yeah,
and I know that's not what you're suggesting, but
no, and I do want to say and add to that. In all the work that I've ever done with financial education, to be honest, a lot of the lessons that I've learned the best are the people that have had the least amount of money to budget. They've taught me more as far as how to get by on some of those situations than a lot of the education the formal education that I would say. So. I think she's exactly right in the fact that you have to have the money to do that. When we were talking with families going through foreclosure counseling, they didn't have a job. So how do you put an emergency budget together when you don't have any income coming in? And I think that's the challenge that, we can only do so much, and a lot of it is education at trying to help people get where they're at. But a lot of times there has to be that give and take. There has to be the dollars that come to be able to budget in the first place. So we can think about, developing goals, and we can think about setting aside, and the earned income tax credit is a great influx of money, and so we can help people plan for that appropriately, but there has to be an income that's coming in as well.
I just wanted to say that when we're talking about the cash assistance portion of receiving, I'm with a nonprofit, and for over 10 years, we get from Michigan Works, DHS, pathway programs, JET programs, volunteers. And they usually have to come to us minimum 15 hours, up to 30 hours and volunteer. Is there any way to educate the nonprofits out there to let them know that working and getting that earned income as a more reward than working for us for free, literally, in order to receive something that's a little of nothing?
I agree with you. I think helping to educate. I think back in the early 2000s, there was a lot of work in the state of Michigan to try to promote the earned income tax credit because we were seeing millions of dollars go unclaimed, and so there was big initiatives around setting up coalitions. I believe there was 40 different communities that had a pilot.
And that remains the case today. In terms of financial literacy and the earned income tax credit, 4 out of 5 who qualify for the credit claim it. That means that 1 out of 5 recipients who otherwise could have a credit are leaving money on the table. And that hurts my heart.
But what about the ones that are, if they're receiving the cash assistance, they're forced to volunteer with a nonprofit in order to receive it? So they're doing a job. So transferring it you're working already and alerting the nonprofits that if they are working and earning something, it's a little bit different than being forced to volunteer for up to 30 hours, minimum 15 to 30 a week, when they're having to find childcare, transportation to get there. They're actually doing the work, showing up and doing it for free just to get the assistance to translate that into a real job.
I think you've got a great point.
Yeah, I think you know what you're saying. I mean, there's been a lot of education around not leaving the earned income credit on the table, but we've got incentives and disincentives that no one's really aware of.
It's a different kind of snare.
And you could even use one of those behavioral approaches that I talked about with the nudge. I mean, just setting a letter out and letting people know, here's what this benefit could do, or maybe it's just the way we communicate or we reframe it. But that could be something that could happen as well. And that's just a behavioral approach, behavioral motivational approach to take.
Mm-hmm. I think you've created a challenge for yourself.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, our nonprofit, we train the person to get into a job, and we make them go through our computer literacy, so at least they have some type of entry level. But what about the other nonprofits out there that they just use the volunteers just for the free work? That there should be some requirement at some point that they leave those agencies and get a job.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's one question over here, and there are two questions over here, and I think that will
question for Dr. Sykes.
sum it
In your
up.
research on the EITC, have you shown the breakdown between urban residents and rural residents? No.
No. Ours was a qualitative approach. We did quantitative measures, so we had numbers in our study, but ours was to find the meaning making around how people think about spending the income. Those numbers are available because you can actually find, there are wonderful infographics online about the earned income tax credit. Brookings puts some out. So if you go to brookings.com, you can identify, I think at the county level, and particularly you could, at least at the county level, it shows you what the uptake is and what the estimated uptake would be, because we know what people's tax forms tell us should be happening.
You can get it by zip code.
Yeah,
Go
zip
onto the
code.
IRS site, IRS data set.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've seen that actually. Our microphone goes over here to Steffi. Thank you, Melanie.
I have a question for the MSU Extension people. So one of the things that helps with the American Dream is having a piece of paper that says you're qualified, either through post-secondary attainment, either certificate or degree. Do you guys have any particular programs or workshops that help get people access to college?
That's a good question. So MSU Extension is more of a community education type of program, community outreach. So we don't, that I'm aware of, but I feel like hopefully I'm not saying anything incorrectly. Bill, I'm looking at you. I don't know that we do any.
So like FAFSA sign up.
So no, we don't do any education in that respect. It's more of community education. Now, as part of our financial and homeownership education team, we do education around student loans, and we talk about FAFSA and we talk about the process, but we don't facilitate that opportunity. So it's not like we have somebody from financial aid out in our extension offices that are doing that work. It's more of a community organization a lot of times in that local community, and the education that is being provided. Yeah.
Yeah. There have been a couple of communities that have begun to require the FAFSA to graduate, completion of the FAFSA to graduate from high school. And I think it's a great model, but a lot of people don't realize the kind of money that's available until they do that.
It's interesting you mentioned FAFSA because I've heard that time and time again. People from counselors, they're so surprised that.
FAFSA for next year is now open.
And you're one of those
Can I
folks.
answer that? There's something called the WIA money, the Work Enforcement Opportunity Act money that comes through that a lot of the participants in the programs, of low-income programs, qualify for. The WIA money was increased from $5,000 to go to school to $10,000 to supplement those who may have issues with obtaining FAFSA for some reason, either because they're dropped a class and dropped below the
Full-time, part-time.
yes. And so there's other programs out there, and sometimes when a person has a family, they're not going full load to qualify for the FAFSA. And so then the WIA money is out there too.
I believe the parents are required to complete it as well, and sometimes people at that age cannot depend on their parents. Your question?
Okay, so my question is, it seems, and this is more from my own experience in the work world, is it certainly seems that over the decades that I've worked, that the one issue is that the workforce has become less forgiving of maybe employees who are more mediocre. I mean, I can remember my own employer through the years having people on staff who maybe had health issues or family issues and were basically phoning it in, and they were just sort of allowed to be on cruise control until they retired, really. And it seems like, especially since the recession, employers really want every employee to be above average. And for employees who may have a health issue or something like that, it has become a much less forgiving to get a job and keep a job. Is my perception right on that, or that it is harder for people who may have issues working?
I don't know that anyone here has really done that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the person then who works on poverty reduction tries to get people jobs. I mean,
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think there are probably a lot of causes for that. I mean, the recession, certainly.
Right.
I think union and other issues and different attitudes about that, here in Michigan. But I think that's true.
I mean, and I'll say that as someone who's in her 50s, and I can see people who I know who, in the past, the employer would have just said, we're going to keep this person on, and whether it's they're going through depression or a physical health problem or something, and now they're just getting cut loose.
Well, I think the other thing is just the sort of the reality that those, the idea, for example, that when I began my career, the idea of General Motors going bankrupt was impossible to consider, and it was better than the government, right? And and now they've both gone bankrupt, governments and GM. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the other driving force in that is that the companies haven't been able to be as forgiving.
Right. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily.
We need to tie it up, but yeah, another good point. So a few things have come up in our discussions that are good conversations to have with your legislator or your local officials, because they're pretty good. They're pretty good questions. Like we said, we knew going into this conversation that it was big and vast and messy and complex, and we brought some excellent resources to you to stir up the conversation about this, but we need to have continued conversation about this, just the exchange between the panelists and the information that they provided and your questions. A good number of ideas have erupted. So we will put these presentations on our website along with some of the resources that you heard about today and some of the research that have been accomplished by our panelists. I'd like to ask you to help me to thank the panelists, but first, before you do, I promised them last word, and I'm going to start with Dr. Sykes and ask her for her closing statement, and we'll just go through the panel. Thank you.
Your questions have brought to mind that if we could wave some kind of magic wand to get us to the point where the American dream was more than a mythology or a national promise that is yet unkept, we would do a lot of things. We would attend to early education, health. We would certainly look more critically at income and job opportunities. But to keep my message short and sweet and to not diffuse what my takeaway message is as you leave, I will say that unequivocally the Earned Income Tax Credit is an excellent vehicle for promoting assistance to vulnerable families in Michigan, both those who are poor and those who we call the working near poor. And so I would say that there is no more effective policy that is so, as I said in my talk, like pro-family, pro-work, and anti-poverty. So if you get a chance to advocate for the statewide Michigan Earned Income Tax Credit, I hope that you'll get behind it, because seeing it reduced from 20 to 6% is disheartening. So we can do better, and we should do better.
Thank you.
So I think I would leave everybody with just 2 points. One is, I think, really thinking about the research that I did and really understanding the person that you're working with. I think sometimes we design policy and we don't always think about the people that will be using the policies. And so really kind of understanding why are the people in particular situations that they are, what is the experience that they're going through, and what does that really feel like? Because I think sometimes we don't always think about that. And then 2, I guess I would say we need to be creative. We need to think a little bit outside the box. And if that means, and this whole behavioral approach of motivational approach of thinking about how we are doing things differently, like I showed you with the student loans, you know, it was just simply sending out a letter and letting people know what was happening. And so sometimes I think we may need to think about reframing our message a little bit and thinking about things a little bit differently, being creative, instead of doing things the way that we've been.
Very good. The power of the nudge.
Yes.
I've really liked that. Stuck with me. Bill?
Right, and kind of building on that and what others have said, the bigger policy changes, the bigger goals need to move on and change over time, whether it be in health, physical health, or financial health, take time. But I guess in my experience, what I would leave with, and I said this before, that there needs to be that opportunity to receive that education, to receive those nudges, and the understanding and the patience to know that it's not necessarily going to be received the first time or the second time or the third time. It's going to be received when it's ready to be received. So the opportunity needs to be given as much as possible as far as that goes. And that as far as linking policy and the whole issue of punishment or reward and with some of the programs that are out there, or whether it be work with achieving earned income tax credit, those are good things that need to continue to be looked at even closer to help nudge and change behavior.
Good. Thank you.
I asked one of our program leaders that question, who serves our clients directly, and she said that if there were one thing that she could ask people to do, it would be to try to creatively eliminate some of the barriers that make it more difficult for people who are trying to do the right things and improve their lives. You know, she walked me through sort of the challenge of what it takes to cash a check, or the kind of impact that poor credit has on a simple loan in terms of cost, that we create a never-ending cycle that gets more and more difficult to escape, and we need to come up with creative solutions to address those barriers to opportunity.
Good. Thank you. Thank you all. Could I get some help? Yeah.